Hey everyone, maybe not so quick as the last video, but again, one of the questions that keeps coming back, and I keep increasingly becoming clear why in the last 5 years, seriously, I've been really questioning the archetypal maps that there are. So the first time I came across something that I'm going to refer to as an archetypal map was Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, with all its different stages and the passageways that we go through, the various thresholds through life. And it's a really powerful map, and obviously it's archetypal because we see it in our stories. We see, George Lucas read The Hero with 1,000 Faces and was inspired to create Star Wars. Joseph Campbell, the guy who wrote Hero with 1,000 Faces and many, many other books, some of which you'd have to study for 10 years before you could even begin to understand them, are mind-blowingly complex in their nuance, and I believe their accuracy. But he wrote that book based on this idea that there's a hero archetype, and that hero archetype kind of carries us through life. It keeps wanting challenge, it keeps wanting to learn and to grow beyond its current state of consciousness. And that's the rub of it. And in that growth process, we continually meet situations that we don't think we can deal with, that we don't understand, that we think have probably got nothing to do with us, that we are confounded by, sometimes broken by. And Joseph Campbell asserts, and I totally concur, that that's life's invitation to invite you to participate more fully, to look for resources you didn't know you had in places you didn't know existed, and to bring them back into the world. And if you think about it, that's how life operates, right? That's how life keeps generating itself. That's how it stays fresh and new and creative. And that is the essence of life. Life with a capital L is a creative unfolding process. It's not a certainty. It has no specific destination that we can really understand. We'd have to go off into the realm of astrophysics and all kinds of other things to even start to begin to understand the complexity of what Gregory Bateson, in his book Mind and Nature, which suggests they're separate, he calls the weave of the total complex. And I don't really know what he means by the weave of the total complex, even though I've read the book a couple of times. But my sense is, in its simplest terms, that life is a system. Right, it's a complex, interdependent array of things, bits and pieces, these stones, these trees, these heather, these lichens, me, my thoughts, my body, my behaviors, my intentions, my dreams. I don't mean my hopes and dreams in that regard, but the dreams that I have, are expressions of consciousness. And I much prefer that story to consciousness is in my head, and if I'm not thinking it, it doesn't exist. I think, therefore I am. Descartes, I think. So I much prefer the weave of the total complex. And I love the idea of the hero's journey. It's a brilliant idea, and it's true. It's we see that pattern. Indeed, Joseph Campbell studied mythology. These deep meaning-making stories that humans have out of necessity. They're not a luxury. They are a necessity because they give us a sense of personal belonging, and then our lives context and therefore meaning, if we care to embrace it. And they give our little clan, our little tribe in indigenous culture, certainly a sense of relationship to their environment, the piece of land they inhabit, whether they are moving through it, whether they're hunting and gathering. The hunting, gathering clans slowly moved across vast landscapes. Generally, they stayed in certain areas where they knew they could find and forage for what they needed to sustain them. So they had patterns through the seasons. And then those meaning-making stories extend. People look up to the stars, and it gives that tribe who are located to themselves, to each other in a tribe, and that tribe to a place. It gives that tribe a sense of, like Black Elk. He understood that the center of the universe was the top of Harney Peak, the central mountain of the universe in Black Elk speaks. It was his local mountain. It was the biggest hill around. It was the highest point. But he also understood that the center of the universe was everywhere. So he understood this. To the rational mind, it seems paradoxical. To the wild mind, to the deep imagination, it's obvious. It's absolutely obvious. So maps, archetypal maps, Joseph Campbell's map being the first one I really came across. And then Bill Plotkin's, the nature-based map of the psyche, and the way that we travel through that. Yes, absolutely brilliant map. And then I came across Robert Moore's map of the masculine psyche, the king, warrior, magician, lover. And a profound map, that's not just 4 archetypes, it's at least 24, and includes a hero archetype, a different kind of hero though. The hero in that sense, in that map of the masculine psyche, is pathologically adolescent beyond the age of 20, because it's constantly looking to prove something. It's not in service to anything larger than itself, whereas Joseph Campbell's hero has this transpersonal function to it, where it's by doing these things with this intention, by honoring the deep call I feel within me to explore and be curious about this particular aspect of my life, by doing that to the full, following my bliss, he would have called it, we uncover something that is useful to humanity, to our community, to our family, to our friends, to our colleagues. It doesn't have to be in some grandiose way, it can be in a really small way, but it's useful. It means something beyond just us. And so those maps are really powerful, they're really useful, and they are a good landing place for anybody who is disoriented, who had to, what the fuck is happening in my life, where the world stops making sense to the immature ego. Is the world doesn't make sense in many ways at the moment, does it? So to the immature ego wanting to wake up, that's a terrifying proposition, to really look around at what's happening and really see the systemic destruction that we are bringing upon ourselves. So those maps are a great place to land, to go, okay, there's some kind of sense that there's a context for my life, and these archetypes give me some of the pointers, some direction as to where I might be, what my next phase might be psychologically, how I might be evolving, how I might be regressing, where I might be stuck, what kind of resources might be useful for me round about now, how do I constellate them, gather them, and start to act upon them, put them together in a way that works for me. But here's the downside to those maps, is they very quickly, and you could think about religion in this way too, you could think about the Bible as a map, as an archetypal map. You could think of academia as an archetypal map. You could think of politics as an archetypal map if you wanted to, because those kinds of ways of thinking and organizing and structuring and engaging are universal. And the players might change and the values might change, but the process itself has a sense of continuity to it. That you can see that replicated. That's what Joseph Campbell studied, right? The mythologies of the world. All of his podcasts are on Spotify, by the way, if you're interested. Joseph Campbell Foundation. I suggest you have a paid subscription so you can listen to it in sequence, because listening to Joseph Campbell talk about mythologies from all over the world on shuffle gets very confusing. Anyway, so the problem with those maps is that they tend to become fundamentalist. and to kind of make that point by stepping away from that point and using a different context. I'm going to tell a story about Bessel van der Kolk, who's the trauma therapist. He's the guy who was a young doctor, wanted to be a psychiatrist and could get paid to study to become a psychiatrist in America. So he went from Holland to America and wound up in Boston, I think. And the Vietnam War was in process and starting to come to a close, and he was sent to what was called the VA, the Veterans Association, to work with some men who were coming back who had issues with alcohol, drugs, violence, etc. And so he sat down with a bunch of men, bunch of guys, and put a program together for them for about a year, and started just talking to them, listening to their experiences, seeing if there was any kind of pattern to it, if there was any kind of way that he might help them. Along the way, he came to understand what was called shell shock at the time is actually post-traumatic stress disorder. He gave it that name. And he also developed something called the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is what psychiatrists use to diagnose people. Clusters of symptoms showing up repeatedly in specific context gives you a diagnosis, right? A psychopathology. So he's the guy who was kind of involved in that. And he worked with these guys for over a year, and he got to know them, and they got to know him, and they built trust with him and each other. And remember, these are returning veterans, so they've all got a lot of shared experience of being at war and seeing horrific things and perhaps doing horrific things. And they've all, in some way, shape or form, been traumatized, as we would say now. But that language and that understanding didn't exist in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. So he sat with them for a year, and they met every week in the VA building, and they learned a lot, and they started to calm down. They started to find some sense of regulation in their nervous system. That's what trauma is. It's a dysregulation of the nervous system. Much more than anything else, it's physiological locking in of a survival strategy, a very primal survival strategy where we go into fight, flight, freeze, or fold. And then we get triggered and we act out as if the threat is upon us now, even when it might have been 20 years ago. Anyway, so they started to find regulation with each other and started to get into a groove with each other. And their episodes of addiction and violence started to diminish. So this is progress, right? So at the end of the year, that particular group was coming to an end, and he went along to the last gathering, the last meeting they were going to have, and they said, "We got a present for you." He's like, "Oh, great, thanks very much, I'm really touched." And they presented him with a uniform, and they were all military, ex-military, and they all had a certain uniform, were all a similar kind of rank, and they'd had a uniform made for him. They'd got his measurements somewhere, and it was a really smart uniform, and he kind of, they made a little presentation to him, and they were all expressing their gratitude for each other and the process and the difference it made, etc. And he's receiving this uniform, but then all of a sudden he has this kind of like moment of realization where he's like, "Oh shit, I can't receive it, I can't take it." And he realized in that moment that what had been happening is that they had been regulating with each other, because we are relational creatures, we're hardwired to relate, so we are looking to connect, attune and resonate with each other. If you want to know more about those terms, look up Laurence Hellier's brilliant book, Healing Developmental Trauma. And so they had regulated with each other as traumatized people, and they were initiating him through the gift of the uniform into their trauma clan, as it were. He was becoming part of their tribe, and they had regulated as a traumatized person, and they'd built trust with him, and they were like, "You're one of us now." And he was like, "Oh shit, that wasn't the intention." the intention was to help them build resilience and resourcefulness so they could go back into the ordinary world and live there as healthy, whole people and choose their lives beyond the traumas of war. And that radically changed his thinking and his understanding of trauma. So in that, what we have, which is very common, is called a trauma bond, where people get together who are consciously or unconsciously have been traumatized in a similar way, and they start to relate to each other. And of course, trauma fragments the relational field. So if you have experienced trauma, I've experienced trauma, quite a lot of trauma in my childhood, and several other massive events in my life. And if I didn't understand some of the things I've learned as a psychologist, I probably would have killed myself. I'm pretty sure I would have. Actually, I'm definitely sure I would have. Because I understand that trauma fragments the relational field. And what that means is you lose your sense of connection to yourself and to everything around you. So you have this acute sense of isolation, at the same time as a massive sense of being overwhelmed. And that's really your nervous system. At a fundamental level, that's your nervous system not being able to regulate and become coherent with the other organs in your body. You feel internally fragmented, dissociated, we might say. So your thoughts don't make sense to you. They seem really random. Your emotions don't make sense to you. They seem really random. And they all, like bits of you, seem to live in different universes that can't speak to each other. So if trauma fragments the relational field, and then you meet other people who have a similar pattern, who have a similar way of speaking, who are suffering similar symptoms, you feel like you're home because a relationship is dependent on mirroring, on other people seeing us and accepting us as we are. So if you meet someone who's like, yeah, I've got the same thing, right? It's the same with train spotting, it's the same with politics, it's the same with all these different tribes that we have, all these different clans that we have, all these different ways of associating and making a sense of belonging for ourselves. Because belonging equals safety, right? To the and it means safety in a survival sense for the child aspect of us. To be rejected means death for the child aspect of us. And we all have that. That never really goes away. But as we grow and become adults, we develop certain skills and resources and sense of resilience that allows us to kind of turn the volume down on that so that we can keep doing interesting things and growing. My last video about meeting resistance, working with resistance from fail to flow, is about meeting those places inside of us that are resistant. A lot of that is about fear of abandonment. In any context, that's not, you can look from externally like the most successful business person in the world, and often a large chunk of the motivation for those people is to not be rejected, to have an accrued sense, an affiliated sense of power derived from external criteria rather than their own deep sense of power. So there's Bessel van der Kolk and this trauma bond that he's just bonding has just started happening, and then group think. Right, so trauma bonding, a bunch of traumatized people getting together, relax in each other's company because they're all the same. They're all suffering the same things, and then you have groupthink, where people start making the rules for being part of the traumatized clan. And these are the rules, and if you agree with these rules, you're in, and if you don't, then you're out. So when we look at any fundamentalism, fanaticism, monotheistic religion has one hands down in that regard, where this God is the God and all the other gods are a fail. we can't really be creative because we don't have access to the resources. We won't allow ourselves to access those certain things. So how does this relate to maps, archetypal maps? Those archetypal maps, as we understand them, the king, warrior, magician, lover, my experience in the Mankind Project, is you get lots of people who look at the map and they're trying to fit themselves into the map. And you look at Bill Plotkin's map, you look at John Young's map for the, what was his entity, the art of mentoring. And people start trying to fit themselves into the map and identify with the map. Now the map, and this is really important, is not the territory. The map is not the territory and is never going to be the territory. So those maps give us, at best, they are a beacon, they're a lighthouse. If you're lost on the sea, they're a good lighthouse. They can say that, land is here. Stay away from these rocks, or this is the coast, or this is the harbour entrance. But they're not going to help you walk on land. They're just a signpost. And if you mistake those signs for symbols, you are really in trouble, because you have just joined a cult. Because you will keep asserting that this map says that we must behave in this way, and if we can't behave in this way, we're damned, essentially. So that is true of, I would say, of all of the organizations and entities that I've come across, worked with, lived amongst. That is what is happening a large degree of the time, often completely unconsciously. We don't choose. No one who belongs to a cult generally would say they're a member of a cult. They would assert that this is the right way, right? Because they've mistaken a sign that's supposed to direct them to something in their interior for something that has a global value for everybody. So there's no understanding of transference or projection, etc. Compensation, decompensation, whatever language you want to use. And that's causing the world to fall apart, to tear itself apart quite actively. It's not a passive thing, the age of extinction we're living in. We're very active in it. Because passivity isn't doing nothing, it's doing a lot of the wrong things. Often in a very organised, earnest fashion. So, the WildMind Deep Nature Immersion, my experience, starting in 1997, my own process of kind of waking up to the fact that my work as a project manager, program manager in IT for a large carbon company, British Gas, Transco, National Grid, it didn't really fit with my values anymore, that I'd spent most of my life out in nature, since I was kind of 7 or 8 years old. I was always off in the woods playing my bike and roaming around, exploring fields and woodlands and getting as far from town as I possibly could. A habit that seems to have stuck. Is that the territory is what we need to work with. And the territory that I work with is the psyche, not a map of the psyche, as it presents, constellates, and requests attention, and seeks to organize and create within each individual. So this is the major kind of sticking point for people who want to undergo the deep nature immersion. They might have the School of Lost Borders map, or the Animas Valley Institute map, or some other map. And because I do this work in this realm, they assume I've got the same map as them. And when I don't mention that, when I don't start invoking that map as, so where are we all on this map? And I start referring to the body and referencing, how people are feeling, what's happening in their body. You'll hear me repeatedly talk about what's happening below your neck. What sensations are you aware of? What memories do they conjure? Might they conjure? Take time, slowing down, breathing, becoming present to our somatic intelligence. People then want to go back to the map, right? They want to invoke the map again. They want to find where that experience relates to their understanding of a map, their intellectual understanding. So that's why I don't use maps, because the body's got everything you need. And Bessel van der Kolk wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score about trauma. But the body doesn't just keep the score. It's not just keeping a record of everything that's ever happened to us, which it does. It also holds all of the potential for healing, for creativity, for understanding, for relationship connection. That intelligence never goes away. It might become profoundly disorganized. We might never have had an experience of it being online in a good way for us. That doesn't mean it isn't there. It means there are certain ways of approaching and invoking, often looking at the exact symptoms we want to run away from, hold a key to how we might start to invite something larger within us to come forward and integrate those experiences. And if we're always looking at the map, well, where are we on the map? Where are we on the map? Which way now? It's a good thing to do when you're up in the mountains and it's a whiteout. But when we're dealing with the interior landscape, it might be good to have some touch points sometimes and to explain context. But really, the wisdom is beyond anything a map could describe. It's pre-verbal, it's somatic, and it relates to a unique narrative that we each carry. And so the maps are maps of collective, conscious experience, what Carl Jung would have called the collective unconscious. That's what archetypes are, nodes on that map. The deep map of humanity's collective experience over eons. Maybe other things as well. Read his book, Carl Jung's book, Papers on the Earth Has a Soul, if you're interested in that other aspect. But your story, your narrative is unique. And so it feels disrespectful to me to try and make you fit into a certain map. And I've seen many cases where it's actually been damaging for people. They get stuck and over-identified with a map, as if that is the only way, and that is exactly what stops them from healing and growing. It's like they wrap themselves in it as a safety blanket, which is often understandable, but more often very unhelpful. So that's why I don't use maps.